The chamber had been empty for 11 days before anyone noticed the humans had left something behind. It was not a weapon. It was not a message. It was a single chair, positioned precisely at the center of the conclave floor, the deliberative heart of the Galactic Administrative Accord, where 43 species had gathered to vote humanity out of every meaningful institution in the known galaxy. The chair was unremarkable. Manufactured wood, the kind humans had been crafting from terrestrial timber for thousands of years. 4 legs, a worn seat, and carved into the backrest, barely visible unless you leaned close enough to study it, were 7 words in Terran standard that no translator algorithm initially flagged as significant. We have been here before. We will wait. The delegate from the Vorath Collective was the first to read it. She stood motionless for a long time in the empty chamber, the ambient hum of the Accord's climate systems filling the silence. Then she called her superior. Then her superior called the Accord's security directorate. Then the security directorate quietly sealed the chamber and spent 3 days debating whether to destroy the chair or leave it. They left it. No one could agree on what destroying it would mean. That detail, that small, paralyzing indecision about a chair, was the first sign that something had already gone wrong. Not with humanity, with the Accord's understanding of itself. Mara Os had been the last human to leave the conclave chamber. She had not planned to be. She had simply stayed to watch the vote finalize, sitting in the human delegation's observation tier while the tallies scrolled across the display arrays. 41 in favor, 2 abstentions, 0 objections from humanity's former allies. The Accord had stripped the Terran Cooperative of its voting rights, its institutional seats, its access to the interstellar commerce framework, its representation on the Joint Defense Councils, and its observer status at every scientific collaboration board operating under Accord jurisdiction. Effectively, they had removed humanity from the table entirely. Legally, cleanly, democratically. The vote had taken less than 6 hours. Mara had watched it happen from start to finish without moving. She was not a diplomat by training. She was an environmental systems engineer who had been seconded to the delegation 3 years ago to manage life support consultations on habitat construction projects. She was 38 years old. She had a daughter back on the Kepler station who was learning to play the violin and was bad at it in the specific way children are bad at things they love too much. Mara thought about the violin while the vote finalized. She did not know why. When the chamber began emptying, she stood, carved the message into the chair with a multi-tool she carried for pressure seal adjustments, and walked out without looking back. She did not tell anyone she had done it. That was the second strange thing, not the carving itself, but the fact that she had done it without consulting anyone, and that when the Accord's investigators later tracked her down and asked her why, she paused for a moment and said, because the room deserved to know someone had been paying attention. The investigator, a Vorath analyst named Surath, filed the response under psychologically inconclusive and moved on to more urgent matters. She would return to that phrase 3 months later, when the more urgent matters turned out to be something she had never anticipated and could not explain using any framework the Accord had available. The isolation of humanity from Accord institutions had been 6 years in the making. That detail matters, because it means the decision was not impulsive. It was deliberate, structured, and built on what the Accord's 37 analytical bodies had collectively determined was overwhelming evidence. Humanity, they had concluded, was a destabilizing variable. The specific findings were extensive. Humans negotiated contracts with emotional subtext that other species found manipulative, then expressed genuine confusion when called on it. They formed irrational personal attachments to colleagues across species lines that compromised institutional neutrality. They introduced concepts like acceptable loss and calculated sacrifice into deliberative bodies that had operated for centuries on pure optimization logic, then defended those concepts with a philosophical tenacity that others found aggressive. They had, on 14 separate documented occasions, taken unilateral action during joint operations, not out of arrogance, the Accord's investigators were careful to note, but apparently out of something that translated most closely as they simply could not watch and do nothing. That last behavior pattern was the one that had broken the alliance with the Dravith Consortium 4 years ago. A joint survey mission. A colony ship from the Dravith's client species, the Nalith, had experienced catastrophic hull failure in a debris field. The Accord protocol was clear. Observe, document, do not intervene without consensus authorization, as the Nalith had not signed the emergency rescue accords. The human crew of the observation vessel had intervened anyway. They had saved 217 Nalith lives. They had also breached protocol, contaminated a first contact buffer zone, and as the Dravith Consortium's legal team spent the next year arguing, established a precedent for intervention that undermined 70 years of carefully constructed non-interference doctrine. The consortium's chief delegate had said, during the subsequent tribunal, "We understand the humans believe they were doing good. That is precisely the problem. Certainty about the correctness of one's own judgment is the most dangerous quality any member species can introduce to a cooperative governance system." The tribunal agreed. The Terran cooperative had been formally warned. They had received the warning, acknowledged it, and then, 2 years later, a different human crew had done nearly the same thing under different circumstances. And then, 6 months after that, a human administrator in the Joint Scientific Framework had released data from a quarantined research project because she believed the medical applications were too urgent to suppress, triggering 3 diplomatic incidents and a formal ethics review that lasted 11 months. None of the humans involved expressed regret. They expressed, uniformly, a quality that the Accord's behavioral analysts could not cleanly categorize. The closest approximation in their records was something between resolved acceptance of consequence and deliberate choice of personal cost for external benefit. The analysts had noted this pattern and flagged it as a compliance risk. They had not understood what they were actually observing. The vote had passed. Humanity had been removed, and for 11 weeks nothing happened. This was the part that had confused Surith most, looking back. She had expected a response. Every predictive model the Accord employed had anticipated one: diplomatic protests, legal challenges, a coordinated media campaign through independent information networks, perhaps an attempt to negotiate through third-party species relationships. These were the standard instruments of institutional contestation. Every species that had ever been sanctioned by the Accord had used some combination of them. Humanity did none of these things. The Terran Cooperative's official response had been transmitted within 48 hours of the vote. It was 47 words long, which was extraordinarily brief for a document of that diplomatic significance. It acknowledged the vote, noted humanity's disagreement with the conclusion, stated that the Terran Cooperative would comply with the removal, expressed hope that the relationship could eventually be reconstructed on better terms, and wished the Accord success in its continued work. 47 words. Surith had read it 6 times. Then she had brought it to her director, who had read it 4 times and then said, "They're planning something." The director's name was Counselor Veth, and she had spent 40 years in Accord intelligence, and she had never been wrong about the shape of political retaliation. She recognized the stillness before action. She had built her career on reading it. She was wrong this time, but not in the way she expected. The humans were not planning political retaliation. They were planning something far more difficult to counter, precisely because it was not adversarial in any form the Accord had a defense against. Surith would understand this later. At the time, she simply watched the monitors and waited for the diplomatic offensive that never came. What came instead was quieter, and it arrived not from humanity's government, but from individual humans scattered across Accord space. Humans who had been working inside the very institutions they had just been expelled from, doing jobs that no one had thought to assess for strategic value because they were not glamorous jobs. Environmental systems maintenance on the Accord's 17 deep space administrative stations. Water reclamation engineering on Conclave Prime. Organic waste processing on 6 of the 8 joint framework research hubs. food production consulting for 3 Dravith-aligned colony developments, medical record translation services for species that had not yet fully integrated into the Accord's universal data protocols, logistical coordination for humanitarian supply chain serving 11 non-member species in the outer systems. All of those roles, quietly, were human, and within 3 months of the vote, they began to empty. Not dramatically, not suddenly. The humans had been meticulous about completing ongoing contracts, training successor personnel, writing documentation that was thorough and helpful and practically oriented toward whoever came next. They had honored every obligation. Then they left. The first system to visibly struggle was the water reclamation network on Conclave Prime. Surith found out on a Tuesday, not from a crisis report, but from a maintenance notification that had been elevated through 4 bureaucratic layers because no one at any layer knew how to act on it. The reclamation system was operational. The documentation the human engineers had left was comprehensive. The problem was that the documentation described a system that required a specific set of judgment calls about organic particulate filtration that were, it turned out, almost impossible to codify in explicit procedural language because they were based on sensory and contextual assessment that the humans had been performing unconsciously for 11 years. The Accord assigned Thavari engineers, who were among the most technically accomplished species in the Accord's membership. The Thavari read the documentation and understood it completely and still managed to produce potable water that tasted, in the words of one conclave official, technically compliant but somehow wrong in a way that creates ongoing psychological disturbance. It was not dangerous. It was just persistently unpleasant in a way that nobody could identify or fix. And it got slightly worse, incrementally, over the following weeks, as the system drifted further from the intuitive micro-adjustments it had been receiving for a decade. Surith filed this under Manageable Infrastructure Adjustment Challenge. She was right that it was manageable. She did not yet understand that it was also a symptom. The food production consulting contracts were the next to show strain, and here the situation was less technically ambiguous and more immediately visible. The human consultants had been working with Dravith colony developments on a crop rotation framework that balanced soil chemistry with long-term ecosystem sustainability. Essentially, they had been applying a form of agricultural knowledge developed across 4,000 years of human civilization history to alien soil compositions. The framework worked. The replacement consultants were competent. The problem was that they were operating from a model that assumed stable conditions, while the human approach had been continuously adaptive to soil changes that the model treated as noise rather than signal. 2 harvests came in. They were adequate. The third was 23% below projection. The fourth was 31% below. The Dravith consulted their own agricultural scientists and the Accord's data resources, and both told them the same thing. The soil chemistry was shifting faster than expected, and the adjustment curves were outside the parameters of the current management model. They had not been outside the parameters of the human model. The humans had been adjusting for those shifts in real time, without documenting that they were doing it, because it had not occurred to them that those adjustments were worth documenting. They had simply been watching the soil and reacting. The Dravith brought this finding to the Accord's Agricultural Commission. The commission issued a report. The report's conclusion was measured and careful and completely failed to communicate the actual scale of what had been lost, that the human consultants had been, without ever formally claiming to be, the primary adaptive buffer between the settlement model and environmental reality. Surith read the commission report and still did not understand what she was reading. She would not understand for another month, when the outer system's supply chains began to fracture and the situation stopped being manageable in any meaningful sense. Mara Osai was on Earth when she heard about the outer systems. She was in her apartment in Accra, watching rain move across the city from her window, talking to her daughter on a call that kept breaking up because the orbital relay that handled communications from Kepler Station was under maintenance. Maintenance that was taking longer than projected, because the human technician who had managed that relay system for 7 years had accepted a transfer back to Earth 6 weeks ago. And his replacement was technically proficient, but still learning the relay's particular behavioral quirks, which were extensive and not well documented. Mara did not know that her call was breaking up because of this chain of events. She just knew that every few seconds her daughter's face froze and the audio dropped, and her daughter would wait patiently and then restart the sentence she had been trying to say, with the specific kind of patience that children develop when they are used to imperfect connection with a parent who is far away. Her daughter's name was Quame. She was 9. She had recently decided that the violin was not for her and switched to drawing maps, elaborate, detailed, fantastically inaccurate maps of places she had invented, given names she had made up, with careful notation of what lived there and what the weather was like and where the dangerous parts were. She had been building the same map for 4 months. It covered 3 wall panels of her room. She described it to Mara during the call, in the discontinuous fragments that the relay interruptions permitted. "There's a place in the north," Quame said, and then the audio dropped. "Called the Cold Shelf," she continued, 20 seconds later, "and nothing grows there, but people live there anyway because they found something underground. I don't know what yet. I'm still figuring it out." Mara thought about this later, about how her 9-year-old daughter, building a fictional map, understood instinctively that people live in inhospitable places because they found something worth staying for. That the question wasn't whether conditions were survivable. It was whether there was something underneath worth the cost of surviving. She thought about this a week later when Ambassador Thuron contacted her. Thuron was not his official title. He had been the Terran Cooperative's deputy cultural liaison to the Accord's Joint Framework for Science and Education, a middle-ranking position with access that exceeded its formal authority, which was why he had held it for 9 years, and which was also why the Accord had not thought to assess it carefully when evaluating which human positions carried strategic weight. His name was Daniel Thuron, and he was 61 years old, and he had spent the last 11 weeks traveling through Accord space not as a representative of anything, but as a private citizen visiting friends. He had a lot of friends. 9 years of cultural liaison work had given him that. When he appeared on Mara's screen, he looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been moving constantly and sleeping badly and doing something that matters to them enormously. He told her that he had been in contact with 417 other humans across Accord space. He told her that none of them had been coordinated by the Terran Cooperative Government. He told her that they had been sharing information through a distributed communication network that used 17 different relay systems and had been architecturally designed to be invisible to any single monitoring authority because it passed through the seams between jurisdictions. He said this matter-of-factly as though describing a route he had taken to avoid traffic. Mara asked him when this network had been built. He said, "About 4 years ago, after the Nalith incident. Some people thought it was worth having a way to stay connected that didn't depend on institutional goodwill." She asked him who had authorized it. He said, "No one, we just built it." There was a long pause. "What do you want?" she asked. "I don't want anything," he said. "I wanted to tell you that the Accord has requested a meeting, not with the Terran Cooperative, with individual humans informally through non-official channels. They sent the request through Vorath contacts. They used a Nalith intermediary on the second hop." "Why Nalith?" "I think because they knew we'd respond to that specifically." Mara sat with that for a moment. The Nalith. The species 217 of whose people were alive because humans had broken protocol. She understood what the Accord was trying to signal. She also understood that understanding that signal did not mean she should trust it. "What do they want to talk about?" she asked. Thuron's expression shifted into something she read as exhaustion wearing the mask of calm. "They want to understand what's happening to the supply chains. They've run the analysis and they can't find a single point of sabotage. There was no sabotage." Everything is breaking because we stopped doing things we were never formally credited for doing, and they don't know how to quantify what that means for the next 6 months. He paused. They're scared, he said, and they're scared specifically because they can't identify what they're scared of. They thought removing us from institutions was equivalent to removing us from relevance. They're discovering that those were not the same thing. Mara looked at him for a moment. Were we actually doing all that deliberately? The positions we took, the water systems, the consulting work, was it planned? Thuron's pause was a fraction of a second too long. Some of it, he said, not all of it. Some of it was just humans doing jobs they cared about and then leaving when asked to leave. Which parts were planned? He didn't answer immediately. Then, that's a harder question than it sounds. It was the most honest answer he could have given. It was also the answer that told Mara something she had not been fully certain of before, that the line between coordinated strategy and organic human behavior was, in this particular situation, genuinely blurry, and that this blurriness was itself a kind of answer. She agreed to the meeting. The Accord's informal delegation included Counselor Veth and Sureth, and 3 others whose institutional affiliations Mara clocked but did not comment on. They met on a mid-tier station above the Accord's 5th administrative zone, neutral enough to be non-committal, which told Mara that someone had thought carefully about the optics of what this meeting implied. Counselor Veth opened by saying that the Accord wished to understand the current situation with supply chain disruptions, and whether the Terran Cooperative intended to seek renegotiation of the removal terms. Mara said, "We don't intend anything collectively. We're not a collective. We're humans who left jobs," Veth said, "but the pattern is people leaving jobs when they're told they're not welcome," Mara said. "That's the whole pattern." Sureth, who had been silent, spoke up. "The communication network," she said, "the distributed relay system, that was built before the vote." "Yes." "Why?" Mara considered the question. "Because some of us thought the vote was coming and we didn't want to lose touch with each other." "That's preparation for adversarial conditions," Veth said. "That's what humans do when they think something important might break," Mara said. "We try to keep people connected." There was a long silence. Sureth was watching Mara with an expression that Mara could not read well, which she attributed to species difference and later revised. "The agricultural model," Sureth said. "The soil chemistry adjustment. We've reviewed the records. Your consultants weren't documenting those adjustments because—" She stopped. "Why weren't they documenting them?" "Because when you're watching something and responding to it, you're focused on the thing you're watching," Mara said, "not on describing what you're doing." "That's not a satisfying answer." "No," Mara agreed. "It's not, I know." Veth leaned forward slightly. "We need to understand something. The vote was legal. The grounds were substantiated. Humanity's behavior within Accord institutions was, by any measurable standard, non-compliant with cooperative governance norms. Do you accept that assessment?" "We accept that's how you saw it," Mara said. "Do you understand why?" "We understand that you value predictability and consistency above almost everything else," Mara said. "And we understand that we are neither of those things." "Then why did you persist in those behaviors?" Mara looked at her for a long time. She thought about Quaim's map. She thought about the cold shelf, where nothing grows and people live anyway because of what they found underground. She thought about 217 Nalith people who were alive because someone on a survey vessel could not watch and do nothing. "Because the alternative was to stop being ourselves," she said. "And that's not something we were willing to do for institutional access." The room was quiet for a long time. Veth said, "That is not a rational position." "No," Mara said, "it isn't." And something in the room changed. Sureth felt it. A shift in atmospheric weight that she could not attribute to any specific variable, only to the accumulation of everything she had observed in the past 3 months about a species that had been removed from power and had responded by quietly, without anger, continuing to be exactly what they were. The outer systems crisis broke 4 days after the informal meeting. It was not a single event. It was the simultaneous intersection of 17 infrastructure stress points that had been developing independently and had never been modeled as a connected system, because the Accord's analytical frameworks assessed each sector in isolation. The humanitarian supply chains serving 11 non-member species in the outer systems depended on logistical coordination that had been managed by human administrators who understood those species not through formal protocol data, but through years of accumulated relationship knowledge. What each species' communities actually needed versus what their formal requests said. What transit timing worked with their cultural calendars. What communication styles prevented misunderstanding from escalating into refusal. Without that relational layer, the supply chains did not fail catastrophically. They failed slowly, in dozens of small miscommunications and scheduling errors and cultural misreadings that individually were manageable and collectively were not. 3 outer system communities went significantly underserviced. 1 went dangerously underserviced. The Accord's automated escalation system flagged the problem at crisis level 72 hours after the communities themselves had already begun adapting, which the Accord only discovered because a Thavari monitoring team noticed that the affected communities had stopped transmitting distress signals and initially interpreted this as system failure rather than the actual reason, which was that the communities had determined that the signals were not reaching anyone who could help and had redirected their energy elsewhere. The Thavari team reported this as a communication infrastructure failure. It was not a communication infrastructure failure. Surith was the one who understood what it actually was, and she spent 6 hours writing a report that she then rewrote twice, because she could not make it say what she needed it to say without the report implying something that no institutional document in Accord history had ever implied. The report implied that the Accord had not understood what it was managing when it managed human participation in its institutions, that it had evaluated human behavior through a compliance framework that measured what humans did against what institutions required, and had catastrophically undervalued what humans contributed that institutions could not require, because it could not be specified, documented, or transferred through protocol. It lived in the space between formal roles. It was, in the simplest possible terms, care, not as a policy position, not as a diplomatic strategy, as a daily operational reality that had been invisible because it looked like normal work performed by people who happened to give more than their job descriptions required. She submitted the report. It went up 7 bureaucratic layers in 11 hours, which was unprecedented. Counselor Veth read it at midnight. She read it twice. Then she called Surith and said, "You understand what this means?" Surith said, "Yes. If this is accurate, I've verified it 6 ways. Then we made the vote based on evidence that was correct and a framework that was wrong." "Yes." A long silence. "They knew this," Veth said. "I don't think they knew it explicitly," Surith said. "I think they felt it. I think that's different." "Is it?" Surith thought about Mara Osai sitting in a chamber and carving 7 words into the back of a chair. "We have been here before. We will wait." She thought about what that meant, not as a threat, not as a message, but as a statement of profound institutional memory from a species that had spent its entire history being removed from tables it had helped build and returning anyway to build new ones. "Yes," she said. "It's very different." The Accord's emergency session was called 48 hours later. It was technically classified as an infrastructure crisis review, but everyone in the room understood what it was, the first step in a process that no one had the language for yet, because what had happened did not fit any existing diplomatic or political category. Humanity had not retaliated, had not campaigned, had not negotiated from strength or weakness, had simply left, continued being human across every space they occupied, and in doing so had revealed through absence the precise shape of what they had provided, a shape that no one had seen clearly while they were still there, because it had simply been the texture of functioning systems. Mara was not at the emergency session. She was not invited because her participation was not official, and neither she nor the Terran Cooperative made any move to formalize it. She was informed of the session by Thuron, who heard about it through his network, who had heard it from a Nalith intermediary who had been contacted by someone in the Accord's communications directorate who was, in some chain of relationship and trust that traced back through years of informal human contact. A friend. She sat with the information for 2 days before the formal request came. When it did, it came through the same informal channel, not addressed to the Terran Cooperative, but to her, personally, as a human who had been at the meeting, and who had said something during that meeting that the Accord's analysis team had spent 70 hours trying to precisely evaluate. The formal request asked whether she would be willing to facilitate a series of conversations about what it would take to rebuild a working relationship. It did not use the word reinstatement. It did not use the word apology. It used the phrase working relationship, which was careful and correct and still somehow smaller than what was actually being asked. She called Thuron. She told him about the request. He said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to tell them yes, but I want them to understand something first." "What?" "That we don't need them to understand us," she said. "We've been functioning without institutional access for 3 months. We're managing. The Nalith outer community has us coordinating supply logistics informally now. The Kepler relay is being co-managed by 12 humans on private contracts. We built a communication network before the vote because we thought we might need it. We're fine." Thuron was quiet. "But," she said. "But," he agreed. She looked at her window. Rain again. It rained a lot in Accra. She had grown up here and found the rain completely unremarkable and also always quietly comforting. She had spent years in space, on stations with climate-controlled atmospheres and recycled water, and no weather whatsoever, and she had never stopped finding those environments slightly wrong in a way she could not articulate. "But things are going to get worse for the outer communities," she said. "Not for us, for them. And we can be useful in a way that doesn't require institutional membership if the Accord is willing to accept a kind of relationship it's never had to manage before." "What kind?" "One where we're not in the system," she said. "We're adjacent to it. We connect things the system can't connect because we're not subject to the constraints the system operates under. We're not bound by the non-interference doctrine because we're not members. We can go places, talk to people, do things that Accord institutions categorically cannot do." Thuron was silent for a long moment. "That's a dangerous position," he said, "for the Accord. A human network operating in the spaces their institutions can't reach, doing things their rules prevent." "We've been doing it for 3 months, Mara said. Another silence. "Yes," he said. "You're right. They're going to figure that out," she said. "If they haven't already. That we're more useful outside their system than we ever were inside it, because inside the system we were constrained by the same rules that constrain them. That every time we broke those rules, which they called non-compliance, we were actually doing something the system structurally couldn't do." "The Nalith rescue." "The Nalith rescue," she confirmed. She thought about Surith's report, which she had not read but whose conclusions she had reconstructed from what she knew and what she observed, and what Thuron's network was quietly passing between people who found these things interesting. She thought about what it meant that the Accord's own analyst had concluded that human behavior, evaluated as compliance failure, was actually an adaptive function the system depended on and could not replicate through compliant means. She thought about the chair in the empty chamber. "We have been here before. We will wait." Not a threat. Not a message to the Accord. A message to themselves. A reminder, carved into wood the way humans carved things into stone and wood and skin, and every permanent surface available to them across 4,000 years of civilization, that being removed from places was a condition humans had survived before, would survive again, and from which they had always, somehow, found the path back. Not because they were owed it, not because they were the strongest, because they were the ones who kept showing up. She thought about the cold shelf on her daughter's map, where nothing grew and people lived anyway because of something underneath. She called the response channel. She said yes. Surith was the one who briefed Counselor Veth on the terms. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Veth spent 2 of them pushing back on specific provisions, then stopped, and spent the final hour in silence that Surith recognized as the particular quiet of someone reassessing not just the specific question in front of them but the larger framework through which they had been evaluating everything. Veth finally said, "They were never trying to win." "No," Surith said. They weren't planning retaliation. They weren't building toward a return to power. The network, the positioning, the quiet accumulation of influence outside institutional channels, none of it was designed for leverage. No. Then what was it designed for? Surith thought for a long moment. Then she said the thing that she had been approaching in her mind for 3 months, circling it without quite landing, the way you approach a realization that changes not just your answer but your entire sense of what the question was. It was designed to keep being useful, she said. To keep doing the things they do in whatever space was available. They didn't adapt their goals to institutional access. They adapted their methods to whatever the circumstances allowed. Veth was quiet. The vote, she said, we evaluated it as removing them from influence. What we actually did was remove the formal constraints on how they could operate. The room was very still. Yes, Surith said. Veth sat back slowly. And now we're inviting them back, under terms they specified. Into a relationship we've never had to manage, she paused. A relationship where they operate in the spaces our institutions cannot. Yes. Where our rules don't bind them. Yes. Because we need them there. Yes. Another long silence. What's stopping them, Veth said carefully, from simply continuing to operate in those spaces without our agreement? They're already doing it. The outer systems coordination, the relay co-management, the Nalith supply logistics, they're already there. Surith said nothing. Veth looked at her. They don't need our agreement. No. Then why are they accepting the terms? Why engage with us at all? Surith thought about Mara Os, who had sat in the chamber and watched the vote finalize and then carved 7 words into a chair without telling anyone. She thought about what kind of person carves a message into furniture in an empty room, not for an audience, not for credit, but because the room deserved to know someone had been paying attention. Because they want a relationship, she said. Not leverage, not institutional access, not formal recognition. An actual working relationship with the institutions that govern most of the species they care about. Because caring about those species is not contingent on whether those species formally recognize them. It's just, she stopped, started again. It's what they do. Counselor Veth was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, in a voice that was lower and quieter than her usual register, the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years reading political situations and had just encountered something she had no taxonomy for. That is the most dangerous thing you have ever told me. Surith looked at her. Not because they're a threat, Veth said. Because they're not. Because they're going to be in the spaces between our institutions, doing things we can't do, caring about outcomes we're structurally prevented from pursuing. And they're going to do it regardless of what we offer them or withhold from them, because their behavior is not contingent on our recognition of it. She stood and moved to the window that overlooked the station's transit ring, the slow geometric movement of docking vessels and supply craft, and the distant suggestion of inhabited space beyond. We thought removing them from power would remove them from consequence, she said. We removed them from our accounting of power, not from power itself. Surith said nothing. They were never waiting for us to let them back in, Veth said. Were they? It was not a question, but Surith answered it anyway because it deserved an answer. No, she said. They were just waiting. The lights on the transit ring moved in slow arcs. Somewhere in the outer systems, humans were coordinating supply logistics for communities the Accord's institutions could not legally reach. Somewhere on a mid-tier station, a communication network built in the seams between jurisdictions was passing information between 400 people who had never been asked to build it and had built it anyway. Somewhere on Earth, in a room covered with fantastically inaccurate maps, a 9-year-old girl was deciding what lived in the cold shelf underground, what thing was worth the cost of surviving an inhospitable place, and she was taking her time with the answer because she knew it mattered and she wanted to get it right. The galaxy had voted to strip humanity of power. What it had not understood, what it was only beginning to understand, in the specific way you understand something that reorders everything you thought you knew, was that the power it had stripped was not the power humanity ran on. That power had no institutional address. It could not be voted away. It was not contingent on recognition or access or formal standing, or the goodwill of 41 member species deliberating in a chamber where a wooden chair still sat, at the center of a floor that still felt, somehow, quietly observed. We have been here before. We will wait, not for permission, not for reinstatement, not for the galaxy to understand them or fear them or finally extend the respect that had been withheld. They would wait simply because waiting for humanity had never been the opposite of moving. It had always been its own kind of motion, deep, patient, and proceeding steadily toward whatever was worth finding underneath.